Salvete omnes, and welcome to this week's video tutorial, namely a continuation of chapter 29, imperfect subjunctive, present and imperfect subjunctive of sum and possum, and result clauses. As we said last time, this can be a little bit tricky and take a little bit of time to learn in Latin, just because Latin uses a variety of clause types for this part of the grammar, which we talked about last time. In my experience, the best approach, as noted last time, is to learn the forms, but also look for the particular signpost, if you will, to indicate what kind of clause we need. So in the example of result clauses, we mentioned last time, and it'll be helpful for today as well, is we have ita and tam and sic, and also tantos as indicating a result clause, and ut can also be used with a result clause, but is also much more common with a purpose clause. So recognizing these words, in my experience, can be quite helpful. Your book does have, let's see, I thought I had it queued up here, but I guess not. What I was going to show you is at the end of your book in the appendix. Let's see, I'll find it here, although it's going to, let's see, page 449. I'm not quite sure exactly what page it's on in the Kindle version, so just appreciate your patience here, but it might be helpful to see this. Let's see, this is taking a little bit long here for some reason. Let's see if I try to go back a little bit. No, that's not it. I apologize, I had it queued up, but when I changed tabs, it looks like it closed it. Okay, here we are. So in the appendix in your book, you'll see an overview of the verb system, which is super important in Latin. We talk a lot about nouns and declensions, the I, and so forth. The verbs are a little bit trickier. And here we have an overview of the four conjugations. But if we go to the next page, you'll see an overview of both the indicative and the subjunctive. So Latin has three moods: indicative, subjunctive, and the imperative, giving commands. So this kind of goes back to our basic osmos tisnit. And then, but as we move to the subjunctive, which we're doing here, we've talked about before how the present subjunctive is we, fear, a, liar for the key vowels. But in this particular chapter, of course, we're doing imperfect subjunctive, which you can see is basically the infinitive with our tense endings here. So learning these paradigms, or at least being able to use this paradigm, or overview rather, when you're doing your work in Latin is probably helpful. So you might want to make a picture of this, or just be able to go back and forth between this and the exercises. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and continue with this chapter, namely the two longer passage readings. The first one is Catullus Carmen Septem, or his seventh poem. Very famous. If if I pull up a picture, you can see it's these aren't the most exciting, but very, very famous series of poems by Catullus, who was a contemporary of Virgil, and he was younger than Cicero, but he lived sort of at the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire in the 1st century BC. And this poem, along with many of his other poems, have been the subject of a lot of interpretation and commentary. So that's sort of the literary context for that. But going back to the poem itself, you can see here it says Catullus had begged Lesbia, who was a Roman aristocrat. They were having some kind of liaison or affair, and the subject of this one is his continuing exhortation and expression of feeling for Lesbia. So our topic is how many kisses are enough. The word for kisses in Latin is basia. We may have had that before. So we're going back to the text itself. We have quaeris lesbia quod basia tua sint mihi satis. Tam multa basia quam magnus numera libiciae herenae ad quam sidere multae quae, ubi tacet nox furtivos amores hominum vident. Tam basia multa, nemo numerum scire potest, sunt satis Catullo insano. So again, let's work our way through this using punctuation to help us with the syntax. So here, if you have a word that ends in S, it's probably a verb in the 2nd person singular, and this simply means you ask. So this is where we get the word question or quest. So we can go ahead and put that in here. Fix that there. You ask. Lesbia, that's pretty straightforward, right? So, and then quote, where we get words like quotient in English, is the Latin for how many. So what we literally have here is you ask Lesbia how many, literally your kisses, but probably in English you might say how many of your kisses, even though that would put it in the genitive, but it's just the difference between Latin and English grammar. But literally how many kisses are to me enough. One of the important points of this one, notice that sint is in the subjunctive. So if you go back to either the charts, let's see, do I have it here? Did it already close it again? Yeah, for some reason this Kindle is noted doesn't like that. But if you go back to the beginning of this unit, you'll see that sint is the subjunctive form. This is one of the downsides of doing it online with this format, but it's probably helpful to see. Plus, once again, I think one of the virtues of Latin, I've said many times, is kind of slowing things down. Going slowly is important for most serious work. But here is our sint, and so you can see that is the present subjunctive form of to be. So we've learned for quite a while now, sum, ss, sumos, esti, sunt, but that is the indicative. Here we have the subjunctive form, and so that is the word that is being used. Even in English, we often use the conditional. We call it the conditional, not necessarily the subjunctive. In hortatory texts that indicate possibility or imagination or hypothetical scenarios. And so in this instance, we can compare the use in English to the Latin by using the imaginary form of the verb, namely the subjunctive, as rather indicating some element of imagination rather. So you asked Lesby, how many of your kisses are enough to me? So I'm going to go ahead and just write that down. Literally are enough to satisfy me. Again, I'm going to keep my translation somewhat literal just to explain the grammar. So you asked Lesby how many your kisses are enough, and then literally to me, he. And then Tom is one of our adverbial intensifiers. As many, or so many that, or so in this case we have Tom multum, so many kisses is how we read Tom multa basia. Basia is a neuter noun of the second declension, so it's in the plural. So let's go ahead and write that down. So many kisses. Now quam can mean a lot of things in Latin, but probably in this case it's being used as a comparison, so we're going to go with as. But once again, just to kind of put this in a broader context, you can see quam can be a little bit tricky, but I think we're making a comparison here, and so we're going to use as just based on the context. But then what are we comparing the basia to? So as many as, literally the great number of, Renai means grains of sand in Libyan. So many, right? So many kisses as the great number of sands in Libya. Okay, so we'll just follow, you can say African as well, but we'll just follow this gloss here. Again, if it's in italics, as you know, we're going to go ahead and just use that. Now out, here we have out, which means or. Out means either or as many, right? So in this case, as many as the stars, we can go with that one, or as many, or as many, let's see here, I feel like I'm missing something, or as many as there are stars is probably how I might translate that, but literally, or as stars many that. So I'm going to go ahead and just get a sense of the context and kind of give my own free reading of that based on the vocab. So many kisses as the great number of sands in Libya, or as many as there are stars. And then literally when the night is silent. So here's the comparison. Ubi can mean where, but it can also mean when. So here nox, like nocturnal. So when the night is silent. Now this poem being very, very famous, you can no doubt find many translations of Carmen number 7. A good website for this is poetryintranslation.com. It's also helpful to compare different translations, insofar as a translation is an interpretation. But we can sort of keep this somewhat literal in these kinds of lessons. When the night is silent. And then furtivos amores hominum vident. How do we read that? Literally, see, here they have furtive. Actually, that word furtive does mean to steal. in English. So in this case, that see secretly, literally the loves of men is kind of how that works right there. So the idea here is that the stars are looking down upon lovers and see secretly the loves of men. So let me go ahead and write that down, then I'll try to explain that in further detail. Given the context, we might have to, I put in a that just because otherwise it feels like we're missing something. But in this case, it's referring back to the stars and the night. Stars is plural. And so since it's plural, we're using the plural form of the verb. We can confirm that right here. So that means stars are constellations, but the sidra and vident is the subject-verb agreement on that one. And then so many kisses. So we kind of have a repetition here, right? So tam basia multa, tam multa basia. But we have kind of just a change in word order, which is common in poetry. So many kisses. No one, so nemo means no one. No one is able to know, literally of the number, or no one is able to know the number, i.e. no one can say, so no one is able to know the number. Let's see, just for consistency, I'll change this to a hyphen instead of a comma. You can see with these lessons, in contrast to some previous ones, we're not using the declension chart quite as much. But we could, just for, if I wanted to, again, this is hopefully something you have memorized by now. But if I pull it up here, basia, as noted, is a neuter noun. And so there's our basia kisses in the nominative plural of a neuter second declension. So that is our explanation of the declension ending. And then, and then literally are enough, literally for insane Catullus. So let me go ahead and write that down, and then I'll explain that. So let's see, what was the punctuation then? Okay. Oh. There we go. So, sunt satis, fairly straightforward. Satis, satisfaction, just means enough. What's interesting about this one, this is in the dative, so no amount of kisses are enough for him. So here we have for, literally for insane Catullus. There's probably a more poetic way to translate it, but I'm going to keep it somewhat literal. Here we can see that is Catullus ends in us. That makes it second declension. Second declension, dative singular, is o. So Catullo insano, because dative is to or for whom something is done. All right, so that's a nice poem. There's some questions over here in terms of more interpretation of the poem, but I think it's fairly straightforward. Once we look up the vocabulary, we know that basia means kisses is in the plural, and we have these verbs in the present tense. Maybe this clause right here is probably the trickiest in terms of recognizing right, what this is referring to. But we know that this, namely the stars, is seeing the ferturvos amores. So that's the direct object. So ferturvos amores. So we have our second declension accusative plural adjective. And then the third declension accusative direct object. So vident ferturvos amores. And so this Latin declension chart can perhaps further explain that. All right, we're going to move on to the next reading, namely the nervousness of even a great orator. And this is based on Cicero. And Cicero, of course, was perhaps Rome's greatest statesman. And as we see here, even he got nervous. Public speaking, isn't natural for everyone. But here we read that even the greatest and most accomplished public speakers are nervous. But you'll see here that if we prepare ourselves in a rational, moral manner, is kind of perhaps one way to read this. No substitute for preparation, as you'll see, or not neglecting the seriousness of one's cause. Then, according to the text, that can help us overcome what seems to be a natural anxiety of speaking publicly, especially about important things. Given the fact that a lot of times these important things are not easy to communicate, and because of that, convincing others of their communicability oftentimes becomes incommunicable. But we can communicate on important things if we do so in a prepared, rational, and inspired manner, one might say. All right, so here we go. We have ego de hunc ut responderum surrexi quae sollicitudine animi surgibam, di immortalis et quo timero semper quidem magno cum meto incipio dicere, quotiens cumque dico mihi vedio in judicium venere non solum ingenii sed etiam vertitis atque officii. Tum vero ita sum perturbatus ut omnia timerum, denique me collegi et sic pugnavi, sic omni ratione contende ut nemo me neglexisse illam causam put erat. Okay, as always, we want to use the vocabulary gloss or help that they give us and look up some words. Once you do that, again, there's just no substitute for looking up the words. So once you look up the words in a dictionary, you'll probably have something like this. I, then, to, respond, I got up, about, worry of the mind, I was getting up, God's immortal, and how, fearful, always, indeed, great with fear, I begin to speak. As often I speak, me, I seem, in judgment to come, not only of my mind, but also of virtue and also of duty. Then, indeed, thus I am perturbed, and everything I fear. Finally, me I collect, and thus I fought. Thus all reason I fought, and no one, me, to have neglected that cause can think. Again, that may seem like a silly exercise, but hopefully you agree that if we don't know the vocabulary words, then we're probably not reading and learning the text. And so look up the words, dictionary, Whitaker's words. Putting in that extra work for the vocabulary solves a lot of problems in a foreign language or any language. So with that said, let's go ahead and try to make sense of this grammar and reading and translation. So ego de hinc, Dehink means then. And so I then to respond, I got up. So let's see, I think I made a note on this one. No, I did not. I was looking at my notes on this one. So this one is then I got up to respond. We've learned in Latin, Latin often doesn't use a separate pronoun, as does English. Oftentimes the pronoun or the subject is just part of the ending of the verb, whether it's osmos tisnit or istid, emos istis erunt. But for rhetorical emphasis, you'll often see the pronoun emphasized. And so in this case, we actually do have a pronoun, like in English. And so then I got up to respond. Here's our grammar topic in this chapter. Notice we have ut, and this is a purpose clause. So here we have the imperfect subjunctive, which is the grammar topic in this chapter. And you can see here we have our infinitive followed by the first person singular subjunctive imperfect ending. So we can just simply translate that as then I got up to respond. So let's go ahead and write that here. Let's see, I'm just going to organize this a tad more. A little bit bigger so see it better maybe. That one's not too difficult, as long as we recognize that we have the purpose clause, and then surgo, surgere, surrexi, surrectum is the verb on that one. So hopefully we recognize that this is in the perfect. We can always confirm. You can see here's our principal parts. Surgo, surgere, surrexi, surrectus. In fact, you probably look up the word directly, but you can see it is in the perfect. And so since we have the perfect or past tense, that's why we have the imperfect form of the subjunctive. Quo, this one's a little bit tricky, but we should recognize, or que, that we have the ablative ending. So here's our declension chart. You can see we have a first declension ablative ending A, but then they're using another word. In this case, the word is solicitudine, which, as your book points out, means anxiety. So we get words like solicitousness, silicious rather, but anxiety. But you can see it has an E here, so that tells us it is third declension ablative singular. So these are tricky. The ablative is always the trickiest. So literally, you might read this as by anxiety or with anxiety might even make more sense. And then Sergei Baum means I was getting up. I was rising. So with anxiety of the mind, I was getting up. I'm going to go ahead and keep that somewhat literal. It doesn't sound quite as wooden in the Latin, but that's for reasons that we can't really talk about in this format. Namely, online, it would take a lot of, actually probably be like a 400 level class. So we're going to go ahead and just write that down. So by or with anxiety. I think we said it might be better with anxiety. I was rising, or I was getting up. So the idea here is he's getting up to speak. And so it was his turn to talk, right? He's giving a public speech in the Senate or whatnot. He's giving, actually here, they do give us context here. In defense of Cluentius resulted in the acquittal of a man accused by his mother of poisoning his stepfather. This passage is interesting as it shows the trepidation. So that's the context here. He's defending this man, and his life depends on it. And so it's his turn to speak, to defend this man. And as he's getting up, he feels a sense of anxiety, literally of his mind. He's nervous, you might say. And then he's saying, immortal gods. So that's the first clue, is he's trying to regain his composure by thinking of the gods or the purpose and seriousness of the task. Immortal gods literally end literally by such fear. Here we have the second declension ablative singular quo, and then another word timor, which is third declension ablative singular e. So this is a good passage for reviewing our ablative, which is the tricky case, I think, in Latin. So here's our quo timere. Now how to translate that? Oftentimes it's by, with, from. If you go with one of those, you'll probably be successful. So let's just go with, then I got out to respond with anxiety of the mind. It was rising, immortal gods. And with, I guess this, and with fear is kind of, and then we'll give an exclamation point. Semper quidem magno. Semper means always. In English, of course, we like the subject and verb first, so maybe we'll start with that this time. Is incipio means I begin, like inception. So I always begin to speak with great fear. So quidem means indeed. That's one of our vocabulary words in this chapter. I, always, semper, begin, incipi, to speak, dicere, like dictation, and then with, cum, great fear. So that one is relatively easy once we know the vocab. We've had me too before. It means fear. But once again, back to context, it just shows you that even someone as accomplished and gifted and brilliant as Cicero was nervous. Quotiums cumque dico. This is an adverb. I'm going to go with whenever, maybe. So whenever I speak. So again, let's use our punctuation to stop. Whenever I speak, here we have arrestur murmurinuntur. So this is the passive. Literally, I seem to me. We might even say in English, I think, but I'm going to keep it similar. It's where we, rather literal. It's where we get our word video, of course. It's one of the first verbs in the Wheel Locks Latin, going back to chapter 1 or 2, I believe. So literally, I seem to me. Literally, I seem to be to me, but I'm going to go with just, I seem to me. I seem to me, and then to come, and then In judicum means to come into judgment. In other words, that he thinks he's being judged is kind of is what he means. That people are going to judge the quality of his words by his competency. So whenever I speak, I seem to me to come into judgment. Again, I'm going to keep it somewhat literal so we can follow the grammar, but to come into judgment. So again, he thinks that he's being judged. Eyes are upon him, which is natural. Every time when we often speak in front of others, it's human nature. And then not only, right? So he thinks he's being judged not only about, but literally of his talent. So not only of my talent. This is where Latin is interesting, but also can be challenging. And here's a good simple example to illustrate that. Latin tends not to use possessive adjectives, so my, your, his, our, and so forth. But otherwise, and so I think we need perhaps add that. And so the point being, as I've said many times, when we have to add words that aren't there, that requires imagination and a sense of context. Latin just tends to use a lot less words than English. But not only of my mind. Now, what we should be able to recognize is that inganium is second declension genitive singular. How to translate it, it can be a little bit tricky. I went with talent. That's the word that is used also in the back of the book, but you can see that he thinks he's being judged about his nature. His character would work too, but in this case, I'm going to go with his talent as a speaker and defendant, given the context. But we should be able to recognize that as noted as of in the genitive because it's inganii. So he thinks he's being judged not only about his talent, but also literally of my virtue and also my duty. Not only, okay, so sed etiam means but also. Okay. Virtue and duty, of course, being important in Roman ethics, Roman morals. And so we see this often in Cicero's writings that he thinks that his talent, his virtue, in other words, whether or not he's fit for office, for doing the task, and also duty are coming under the judgment of others. We should be able to recognize this as the genitive. Third declension, genitive singular is is, because virtue is third declension. And then duty, which is a neuter noun, is second declension, so officii. So virtutis officii is how we explain those endings. Tum means then. Tum vero, then indeed, thus. Kind of how that reads there, right? So I'm gonna keep that literal just for practice of this vocabulary, since these adverbs tend to be common in Latin. As noted, adverbs can be tricky to learn, not just lots of practice. So then indeed, thus. So you can see Google Grammar doesn't like the passive nature of the Latin, but as noted, we're going to keep it literal to follow the grammar. Then indeed, thus, sum perturbatus. This means to disturb or to confuse. I think we need to recognize here, going back to an earlier chapter, that this is the perfect passive. So sum perturbatus is we need to see those two words together, because it's not I am confused, but since we have the past tense here, we're going to keep the past tense. So then indeed thus because he's basically giving a recount of how he felt at the time. So he's retrospectively describing in a text how he felt at the time, and so that's why we're going to use the past tense here. So then indeed thus I was disturbed. Disturbed by what? Well, disturbed by these feelings of anxiety, which of course can affect the quality of one's speech. Then indeed, thus I was disturbed, so that, right, I feared everything. So here's our purpose clause. Actually, it could be also interpreted as a result clause. That I was so this was the effect. So that I feared everything. As noted, that can take some time, distinguishing between purpose clauses and result clauses. Only the context oftentimes will tell you. Denique means and then, or finally, I guess it can be finally too. So finally, I collected myself, or I gathered myself. In other words, that got my composure back. So finally, I gathered myself. So finally, I gathered myself, and thus, literally, and thus I fought. In other words, I fought through these feelings of anxiety, is the sense of it here. I can type here. And thus I fought. And then we have kind of a further emphasis, and thus I thought, and then thus, literally by all reason. You might even say, and thus by the power of reason, you might say rhetorically in English, but literally thus by all reason. Once again, I'm going to keep it somewhat literal, but we do have by all reason. This is, reason is third declension. So ratione, the omni is actually is a unique ending in this one, but that's the sense of it. So by all reason, in other words, by the power of reason. Contendi also means it's where we get the word like a contender or a contest. If we look up this, it's going to be contendo. So contendo, contendere, contendi, contentus, it can mean a lot of things. It can mean to compete, contend, dispute. So in this case, he's fighting against these nerves, strain, made an effort, strove, might work nice here. You can see you have some options here. Thus, by the power of reason, I strove. I'm just going to choose one here. Thus, by all reason, I strove. In other words, strove to overcome these feelings of anxiety. So that, right? So here's why he's stroving. So here we have a purpose clause, so that no one, may think or can think, may think that, literally, so that no one may think me to have neglected that cause. And so you can see if we use a kind of archaic form of English grammar, that actually explains the Latin a little bit easier. So that no one may think me to have neglected that cause. English might say, so that no one, may think that I have neglected. So in English, if we put a that in there, then we can change the me to an I, but I'm going to keep it somewhat literal since we have may here. So this one, translating Cicero can be tricky at times, but hopefully the main idea is clear. And we do have a couple examples of the imperfect subjunctive with ut. We also have the difference between a result clause and a purpose clause, which is important to understand. And then just kind of tracking word order and syntax, and this one can improve overall your Latin skills. All right, the last one here, which we'll just do orally since it's kind of funny. Martial, like Juvenal, is often known for his satire. And here we have ne laudet dignos, laudet calistratos omnis, cui malos est nemo, quis bonus est potes. So this is kind of funny. Maybe if we start here, so calistratos is a person. So calistratos praises everyone, lest, L-E-S-T, he praise those who are worthy. Literally, lest he praise only the deserving. In fact, let's go with that one. So Calistratos praises everyone, lest he praise only the deserving. To whom no one is bad, who is able to be good. So in other words, to whom no one is bad, who is able to be good. You can't be all things to all people. So the idea here is a kind of moral relativism. So he's afraid of praising, or rather he praises everyone so that he doesn't praise those who really deserve to be praised. But if that's the case, if no one is bad, then how can we say that anyone is good? So that's kind of a funny play on words here by Marshall. All right. We have one more chapter before your first test. That'll be chapter 30. And then you'll have a week off to prepare for this. As always, please send me emails or come see me during German if you have any questions. And then I haven't decided yet, but maybe after chapter 30, we'll move on to a different kind of Latin beyond the wheel locks. You would need a different textbook because you'll have a digital format. But I'm thinking about changing to mythology, which might be a good change of pace, and in many ways a little bit easier, even though it's the same level of Latin, just because you're familiar with the stories. But stay tuned on that. Hope you're having a good day, and valete.